The snow didn't just fall, it erased the world, leaving Special Agent Elena Vance staring at a ghost stumbling through the white abyss. When her K-9 partner, Shadow, alerted to a hunched figure dragging a battered suitcase, Elena assumed it was a simple rescue until the lock snapped open. Inside, buried beneath tattered clothes, sat a thick yellow envelope labeled FBI evidence, a discovery that instantly turned a humanitarian act into a high-stakes investigation. This was no lost grandmother. This was a woman carrying a secret that could dismantle a legacy of betrayal. Before we uncover why this elderly woman was left to die with classified files, please subscribe to the channel and follow this journey to its shocking end. Also, comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of courage has traveled. The wind howled like a wounded predator, scouring the streets of Denver and turning the city into a frozen test of endurance. Special Agent Elena Vance gripped the steering wheel of her FBI-issued SUV, her knuckles white, her eyes a cool gray that missed nothing despite the sideways sleet. In the back, Shadow, her 6-year-old German shepherd, let out a low, vibrating hum of awareness that made her foot hover over the brake. "What is it, Shadow? Talk to me," Elena muttered. Her voice was a sharp rasp in the quiet cabin. Shadow didn't bark. He simply stood, his amber eyes locked onto a moving shadow that shouldn't have been there. Elena narrowed her eyes, peering through the rhythmic sweep of the wipers until she saw it. A thin, elderly woman hunched against the gale, dragging a torn suitcase through the deep drifts. You've got to be kidding me! Who leaves their grandmother out in this?" Elena hissed as she pulled onto the shoulder, her hazards flickering weakly against the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped out, snow stinging her cheeks as she approached the swaying figure. The woman looked up. She was in her late 60s, her silver hair escaping a gray scarf, her gloved hands trembling violently. "Ma'am! You can't be out here! You'll freeze!" Elena shouted over the roar of the wind. The woman's lips moved, but the words were stolen by the storm. She looked at Elena with wide, unfocused eyes before her knees finally gave way. Elena caught her, feeling how terrifyingly light she was, and practically carried her into the blast of the SUV's heater. Shadow leaned forward, sniffing the newcomer once before settling protectively toward her feet. "My name is Martha. Martha Parker," the woman whispered after a long silence. Her voice was thin, but it held a terrifying clarity. "They told me I had to leave. They said there wasn't room for me anymore." "Who said that, Martha? Who sent you out into a blizzard?" Elena asked. Her mind was already shifting from rescue to fieldwork. Martha didn't answer. She just clutched her battered suitcase like a lifeline, her knuckles raw and cracked. Elena drove toward the only light visible, a 24-hour diner that looked like a glowing refuge against the frozen dark. Inside, the air smelled of strong coffee and fried potatoes, a comfort that felt alien compared to the mountain of snow growing outside. Shadow lay under the booth, his flank pressed against Martha's boots, a silent guard over her every breath. As Martha reached down to adjust her suitcase, the latch caught and then popped free with a sharp, metallic snap. Elena's gaze flicked downward, and her pulse instantly quickened. Peeking out from under a worn sweater was a thick yellow envelope, its edges crisp and official. On the corner, in faded but unmistakable print, were the words, "FBI evidence." Shadow surged to his feet, letting out a single, sharp bark that cut through the low diner noise like a gunshot. Martha froze. her eyes darting between the dog and Elena, her hands fumbling to shove the suitcase closed. I don't know how that got there. I swear I don't," Martha whispered, fear replacing her exhaustion. "Martha, look at me," Elena said. Her voice was calm, the professional tone she used to settle a witness. "Why is there a classified file in your luggage?" "My son, Julian. He packed it," Martha stuttered. Her voice was barely audible over the rattling of the windows. "He told me it was my papers. He said I should be grateful he was helping me." Elena felt a cold weight drop into her stomach. This wasn't just elder abuse. This was a setup. "We aren't going to a shelter, Martha," Elena said. She signaled to the waitress for the check while her eyes stayed on the suitcase. "We're going somewhere private. We need to talk about your son." The storm had swallowed the roads by the time they left, forcing Elena into a roadside motel with a flickering neon sign. Inside the small, yellow-lit room, the heater rattled like loose bones, but it was warm. Martha sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders sagging as if her body had finally accepted it was safe to stop moving. "Tell me about the house, Martha," Elena prompted, sitting opposite her while shadow marked the boundary at the door. "It was paid for. My husband saw to that," Martha said. Her voice was steady now, hollowed out by betrayal. "Julian helped me with the paperwork after the funeral. He said it was just routine. Said I should trust him." "And the doctors? You mentioned they warned you?" Elena asked. Martha laughed, a sound without any humor. "Julian told the neighbors I was confused. He told them I wandered and needed supervision. Funny how easy it is to make people believe that once your hair turns white." Elena leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp. "He didn't just take your house, did he? He's using you to hide something." Shadow moved toward the table, his nose lowering toward the suitcase again. He didn't bark, but he pressed his nose closer, inhaling deeply as if cataloging a truth Martha hadn't voiced yet. "I don't know what's in there," Martha cried. Her control finally cracked at the edges. "He said I was misplacing things. He took my phone. He told me I had to leave because I was a danger to myself." Elena looked at the suitcase. FBI evidence didn't end up in random luggage by accident. Whether Julian had planted it to frame his mother as a thief or was using her as an unwitting mule, he had crossed a line into Elena's territory. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to the precinct," Elena said. Her voice was a promise. "You aren't doing this alone anymore." Martha nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I do," Elena replied simply. She watched Martha finally drift into a fitful sleep, but Elena stayed awake, her mind replaying the image of that yellow envelope. Outside, the storm roared, sealing them into the room like a confession waiting to be completed. Elena knew that when the sun rose, Julian Parker wouldn't be coming for his mother. He would be coming for that suitcase. And he had no idea that a special agent and a war dog were waiting for him. The blue-white flicker of the motel's neon sign pulsed against the window, rhythmically illuminating the lines of betrayal etched into Martha's face. Elena sat across from her, the silence of the room punctuated only by the low, steady breathing of Shadow, who remained a living barrier between the door and the fragile woman on the bed. Martha clutched a paper cup of water, her fingers tracing the rim as if trying to ground herself in a reality that had shifted too fast. "He didn't just take the keys, Elena. He took my voice," Martha whispered, her eyes clear and sharp, stripping away the mask of confusion her son had tried to wrap her in. Elena leaned in, her gaze intense. She had spent years hunting predators, but the ones who hid behind smiles and family ties were the most dangerous. Julian didn't leave you in that storm because he thought you'd wander, Martha. He left you because he needed a ghost to carry his sins, Elena said, her voice dropping to a tactical low. Suddenly, Shadow's ears snapped forward, his entire body shifting from a state of rest to a coiled spring of fur and muscle. A heavy, deliberate knock echoed through the room, not the frantic pounding of a worried relative, but the measured strike of someone who believed they owned the space. Elena moved with the silent precision of a field agent, signaling Martha to stay back as she opened the door just enough to reveal the man outside. Thomas Julian Parker stood there, his wool overcoat dusted with snow and his face wearing a practiced mask of fraternal concern that didn't quite reach his cold, restless eyes. "I've been worried sick, officer. My sister has a habit of wandering when the fog sets in," he said, his voice smooth, professional, and utterly fraudulent. Elena didn't move an inch, her hand hovering near her waist. She could smell the desperation beneath his expensive cologne. "You took my house, Thomas. You took everything." Martha's voice rang out from the shadows, no longer trembling, but landing like a physical strike. Tita and Thomas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, irritation flashing across his face like a crack in a mirror. "I'll need to see the documentation for the property transfer and your legal guardianship, Mr. Parker," Elena countered, her tone a procedural wall that gave him nowhere to run. The air in the room grew thin as Shadow stepped forward, his amber eyes locked onto Thomas's hands with a predatory focus that made the man's charm vanish instantly. Thomas's gaze flicked to the battered suitcase on the table, and for the first time, Elena saw the true face of the hunter who had become the prey. Thomas's eyes darted toward the suitcase with a hungry, desperate intensity that made the air in the cramped motel room feel like it was vibrating. He wasn't looking for a mother to comfort, but for a piece of evidence that could destroy him. "This doesn't need to be complicated, Agent. She belongs with family," he snapped, his voice shedding its polished veneer and turning into something sharp and jagged. He took a sudden, aggressive step forward, reaching out as if the matter were already settled, and his authority over Martha were absolute. His hand closed around the handle of the battered suitcase, but before he could pull it away, Shadow surged from the floor in a single controlled motion that was more machine than animal. The dog didn't bark. He clamped his powerful jaws onto the fabric strap with a decisive force that jerked the bag sideways and ripped it clean from Thomas's grip. The suitcase hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud, and the compromised latch finally gave way, springing open like a confession. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, as folded clothing and a worn photo frame spilled out. And there, glinting under the yellow lamp, lay the thick yellow envelope labeled FBI evidence alongside a small black USB drive. Thomas went pale, the color draining from his face as if someone had unplugged the very source of his confidence. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only the hollow gasp of a man caught in his own web. "Nobody move," Elena commanded, her voice turning into a weapon of its own as she reached for the radio clipped to her shoulder. She saw the panic overtaking Thomas's pretense. He backed away, his hands raised halfway as he blurted out frantic denials that he didn't know how the files got there. Martha sank back onto the edge of the bed, tears finally spilling down her cheeks in slow, silent lines. It wasn't fear, but the agonizing release of someone who had been disbelieved for far too long. Shadow released the suitcase and returned to her side, pressing his warm shoulder against her knee to ground her while the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the morning stillness. As the blue and red lights began to pulse against the motel walls, Elena knelt carefully to secure the USB drive, her mind already cataloging the inconsistencies in the documents. "You were never just her brother, Thomas. You were her jailer," Elena whispered, her eyes never leaving him as the local officers began to crunch through the snow outside. The USB drive held more than just property deeds. It held a damning trail of emails and shell accounts that suggested Thomas hadn't acted alone. The storm had stopped, but the real reckoning was just beginning. And for the first time, Martha Parker looked like a woman who knew she was finally going to be heard. The sirens reached a crescendo before cutting out into a heavy, clinical silence that seemed to vibrate against the motel's thin walls. Elena stood over the open suitcase, her gray eyes tracking Thomas as the local officers entered the room. The air smelled of wet wool and the sudden, sharp ozone of a life being dismantled. Officer Rivera moved with a practiced authority, his shadow falling across Thomas, who had transitioned from a charming brother to a cornered animal in less than 60 seconds. Elena briefed the officers with a flat, tactical precision that brooked no argument, her voice a cold contrast to Martha's ragged, uneven breathing. Thomas attempted to lung forward one last time, a desperate protest dying on his lips as Rivera's hand landed firmly on his shoulder, silencing the pretense once and for all. "You can't do this. It's a family matter," Thomas shouted, but his voice broke, his eyes darting frantically toward the yellow envelope. Elena didn't flinch. She watched the officers escort him out into the biting morning air, her posture unyielding even as the adrenaline began to ebb. Martha finally let out a long, shaky breath, the kind that only comes when the world stops spinning and the truth finally takes a seat. "I just wanted my life back," she whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost to the hum of the heater. Elena knelt beside her, the movement clinical but grounded in a shared weight. "You did the right thing, Martha, and now we see it through." At the precinct, the machinery of justice ground forward with a relentless, humming efficiency. Detective Brooks flipped through the scans from the USB, his jaw tightening as the trail of shell accounts and forged deeds mapped out a pattern of calculated cruelty. This wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a slow-motion execution of Martha's dignity, timed to the beat of her hospital visits and medication cycles. As the prosecutor reviewed the emails arranging expedited filings, Elena felt a different kind of storm brewing, a realization that the yellow FBI evidence envelope didn't match any logged files in the Denver field office. A profound twist emerged when the digital forensics expert signaled Elena over. The USB didn't just contain Thomas's crimes, but a hidden directory of names that shouldn't have been there. Someone else had been watching Thomas, someone who had planted that envelope to ensure Elena would stop her car that night. Martha sat in the victim advocate's office, her new forest green coat clutched in her lap like a shield. She didn't ask about her brother. She asked about her home, her eyes searching Elena's for the one thing Thomas had tried to kill: hope. Elena looked at the evidence and then at Ranger, who was resting his head on Martha's knee, and she knew the mission had shifted from a simple arrest to a fight for total restoration. The cold weight of the mystery surrounding the yellow envelope didn't just linger. It settled into Elena's bones as she watched the precinct's forensic team meticulously log the contents of Thomas's betrayal. The silence in the observation room was absolute until Detective Brooks cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the decrypted emails from the USB drive that showed a systematic dismantling of Martha's life. This isn't just a brother stealing a house, Elena. It's a blueprint for a erasure, Brooks muttered, his voice gravelly with a disgust that matched Elena's own. Elena didn't look away from the monitor, her mind already racing toward the unseen hand that had nudged her SUV into Martha's path that night. Someone wanted Thomas to fall, and they used Martha as the bait to make sure a special agent was the one to catch him, she whispered, the realization hitting her with a sharp, clinical clarity. The machinery of the county prosecutor's office began to turn with a relentless, humming efficiency, locking down titles and freezing accounts before Thomas could even finish his first phone call. Chica, Thomas's earlier performance of fraternal concern, had vanished, leaving only a man cornered by his own paper trail and a mountain of evidence he never expected to see the light of day. While the lawyers argued over the technicalities of document fraud and financial exploitation, Elena focused on the woman who had survived the storm. Martha sat in the Senior Services Center, her hands no longer trembling as she sipped tea from a ceramic pot that had survived the theft of her dignity. She didn't ask about her brother anymore. She asked about the logistics of her own safety, her voice regaining a steady, unyielding strength. Ranger remained by her side through every deposition and every terrifying return to her reclaimed home, his presence a silent anchor in a world that had tried to drift her away. He sensed the exact moment Martha's anxiety would peak, crossing the room to ground her with a steady, rhythmic breath that required no explanation. The twist that finally broke the tension came when the FBI's internal affairs confirmed that the evidence envelope was indeed a fabrication, planted by a whistleblower within the bank Thomas had used to route his shell accounts. It wasn't a crime. It was a desperate, illegal act of salvation by someone who knew Martha wouldn't survive another week of Thomas's care. Elena realized that sometimes, to serve the law, you had to recognize when someone else had risked everything to serve justice. The final court ruling arrived without the thunder of a gavel, but with the quiet finality of a signature that returned Martha's world to her own hands. Thomas was led away to face a reality where his charm carried no currency, his crimes of cold, calculated cruelty finally being given their proper names. Evelyn Parker stood on her porch as the Denver snow finally began its slow, apologetic retreat. Her new forest green coat a symbol of a warmth that was no longer borrowed. She looked at Ranger, then at Elena, her expression clear of the fog Julian had tried to paint over her mind. "I was a ghost in that storm until you stopped," Martha said, her voice rich with a gratitude that went far beyond the legal victory. Elena watched her partner accept a dog biscuit with a regal, solemn stillness, realizing that her work hadn't just been about an arrest, but about restoration. She felt the cold vigilance that had defined her career ease, replaced by a profound understanding of the power of a single choice to stay. The city of Denver breathed again under a forgiving sky, its edges softened by a sun that didn't feel like a test of endurance anymore. Elena climbed into her SUV, catching Ranger's amber eyes in the rearview mirror and seeing the same quiet pride reflected back. She knew that while the truth could be buried under a mountain of snow or a pile of lies, it would always wait for the one person brave enough to stop and dig it out. The storm had ended, but the legacy of that night remained etched into the lives of everyone who refused to look away.